As we have seen throughout this class, the history of human rights has been shaped by certain defining political, social, and economic events of global ramifications. In the 17th and 18th century, it was the Enlightenment and the new ideas about rationalism, human reason, and individual liberties that defined that age. In the 19th century, it was the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement that challenged the institution of slavery and called for the extension of basic civil liberties to enslaved persons. In the 20th century, the defining events included the world wars, the anti-colonial movement, the collapse of empires, and the rise of the notion of self-determination. The 20th century was also defined by the emergence of a new international human rights system under the auspices of the United Nations. In the same way, the human rights in the late 20th century and the first few decades of the 21st century have been defined by three key global trends. These include the phenomenon of globalization, mass migration, and terrorism. In this class, we will examine the implications of current trends such as globalization, mass migration, and the so-called war on terrorism on human rights norms and principles. Scholars generally agree that globalization holds both advantages and disadvantages for human rights. Although globalization is often discussed in economic terms, it is not simply an economic phenomenon. Globalization also has political and socio-cultural dimensions, which simultaneously creates opportunities and represent challenges for the promotion of human rights. Globalization threatens human rights in many developing countries, particularly with regard to economic and social rights. However, globalization has also created new opportunities for the protection and promotion of human rights at both international and domestic levels. The universal human rights movement is itself a manifestation of the globalization of ideas and consciousness about entitlements and the obligations of states and the international community to protect the fundamental human rights of every human being. Economic globalization and the globalization of pro-democratic political consciousness partly led to the fall of authoritarian communist regimes in the Soviet Union and other parts of Eastern Europe in the 1990s. This resulted in the end of the Cold War. The forces of globalization pushed the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to introduce democratic reforms such as glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means restructuring. These allowed for the political liberalization of much of Eastern Europe. In Poland, the pro-democracy activists in that country organized themselves under the banner of the Solidarity Movement, a Polish alliance of democratic socialists and nationalists, to bring about democratic reforms and the collapse of communism in that country. Similar pro-democratic changes occurred in communist countries such as Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. Thus, economic and socio-cultural globalization played important roles in the fall of communist dictatorships and the emergence of more open democratic societies where civil and political rights of citizens were accorded more recognition. While globalization has created conditions for political liberalization and more open societies, it has also created economic difficulties for many individuals and communities, thereby undermining their social and economic rights. Economic globalization has produced winners and losers within and between nations. Much of the benefits of globalization has accrued to large multinational companies and rich Western nations rather than workers or poor countries. Globalization has produced losers even in rich Western countries, with the economic disruptions that have resulted in the loss of manufacturing jobs and the impoverishment of working-class communities. Neoliberal economic disruptions have left millions of people unemployed, while the state's divestment and corporatization of social services such as healthcare and education has raised the cost of living in many developing countries. Corporate barriers on workers' rights and unionization, the use of child labor and slave labor in sweatshops run by multinational corporations are examples of the negative human rights outcomes of economic globalization. Globalization has also resulted in an unprecedented wealth gap between and within nations. Recent reports by the United Nations Development Programme show that the poorest countries are getting poorer, not just in relative terms, but also in absolute terms. Around 1.2 billion people in the world live on less than $1 a day, and 2.8 billion people on less than $2 a day. Alienation and resentment arising from this gaping wealth gap and the rise of mass poverty has fueled religious extremism and neo-nationalist fundamentalism in many parts of the world. This growing wealth inequality has obvious implications for the capacity of states to fulfill their economic and social rights obligations to their citizens. Growing global poverty also creates political instability, social unrest, and violent conflicts that have adverse implications for human security as well as human rights. Globalization has also had a negative impact on environmental rights. The intensification of resource extraction in an age of globalization causes damage to the environment. For example, logging activities in the Amazon rainforest has led to environmental degradation affecting the livelihood of ordinary people, especially indigenous people. Other environmental rights issues connected to globalization include the problem of safely disposing of toxic materials and hazardous waste, marine pollution, deforestation and desertification, and other threats to biodiversity. These environmental issues are connected to human rights and human well-being. In 2011, the South American nation of Bolivia enacted the world's first laws granting all nature equal rights as human beings. They call this the Law of Mother Earth. The law draws on indigenous traditions and enshrines the rights of nature and the environment. It aims to protect nature and the environment from mega infrastructure and development projects that affect the balance of ecosystems and local inhabitant communities. Although economic globalization has produced obstacles to human rights protection, the phenomenon of globalization more generally has also created opportunities for the advancement of human rights. Advances in communication and the growth of social media has had a positive effect on human rights consciousness and activism. This can be described as the globalization of consciousness. For example, the Internet has facilitated communication and created platforms for communities to mobilize social action for political reforms and human rights advocacy. This is evident in the use of Internet communication and social media during the Arab Spring of 2010, when popular anti-government protests and uprisings spread across North Africa and the Middle East, toppling long-standing dictatorships. Another political development that has shaped human rights in the new millennium is the so-called war on terrorism. In response to coordinated attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001, the United States led the international community in a military campaign described as the war against terrorism. The goal was to defeat terrorist and militant groups such as Al-Qaeda. The war on terror extended to many parts of the world, notably Iraq and Afghanistan. The war on terrorism has raised several human rights concerns. These include the indiscriminate use of violence, the use of torture and collective punishment, and the use of government-sponsored abduction and extrajudicial transfer of persons from one country to another, known as extraordinary rendition. These practices reflect a disregard for international humanitarian law. The main concern among human rights scholars and activists is that the war on terrorism sometimes becomes an excuse for impunity and political repression. We should recognize the real concerns about national security in a post-9/11 world, but we must not compromise basic human rights in the name of security. A good example of the need to balance human rights with national security in the war on terrorism is the case of the Canadian Meha Arah. Meha Arah, an engineer of dual Syrian and Canadian citizenship, was detained in 2002 at a United States airport on his way home to Canada from a family vacation. Held without charges in solitary confinement in the United States and suspected of being a member of Al-Qaeda, he was deported to Syria, not Canada, as should have been the case since he was traveling on a Canadian passport. In Syria, Meha Arah was imprisoned and brutally tortured for almost a year. The Syrian government eventually found Arah to be innocent and released him. A Canadian Commission of Inquiry also cleared Arah of any links with terrorism. Arah subsequently sued the Canadian government for complicity in his abduction and torture. He received a $10.5 million compensation and a public apology from the Prime Minister of Canada for Canada's role in what the Prime Minister described as a terrible ordeal. Finally, mass migration resulting from wars and conflict is another major development that has affected human rights in the 21st century. Masses of people fleeing conflict and economic hardship in the Middle East and Africa have sought refuge in Europe. These waves of mass migrants have created neo-nationalist and populist anti-immigrant anxieties in many countries in Europe. These anxieties have pushed politicians to enact laws and take actions that violate the international treaties on the rights of refugees and other vulnerable migrant populations. Many of these anti-immigrant policies violate international law on refugee rights protection, such as the United Nations Refugee Convention. The global migrant crisis has also led to the rise of xenophobia and violence against foreigners in many countries. There is a growing concern among human rights scholars and activists that the challenges of globalization, terrorism, and mass migrations have resulted in a decline of human rights norms and principles. The rise of populist xenophobia in response to mass migration and the abuses that have become associated with the so-called war on terrorism have reversed the human rights gains of the past few decades. Governments enact laws and policies that undermine the international human rights protections for migrants and often disregard humanitarian laws such as the Geneva Convention in the conduct of armed conflicts. The international community seems increasingly unable to decisively intervene or stop genocides and other forms of war crimes. Torture, once considered an unacceptable violation of international human rights, is also increasingly being tolerated by both state and non-state actors. With an increasing number of countries reluctant to honor international human rights treaties or fulfill their own domestic human rights obligations, there is a concern that we might be heading towards what has been described as a post-human rights world, A world in which countries routinely disregard established human rights norms and roll back the international humanitarian laws that have been established in the past few decades. The tentative gains of the post-Second World War human rights revolution appears to be in decline. This is why the awareness of human rights principles and the collective efforts to uphold them remains as important today as they have ever been.